Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle and thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com. Today I'm pleased to be joined once again by a friend and filmmaker who's made some really wonderful short films over the years, Undatement Center, Imposter being among them. His name is Chris Esper. We've discussed a lot of different filmmakers over the years on the podcast, from Martin Scorsese and Andrei Tarkovsky to Francois Truffaut. Today we're going to be doing an individual film, but it's going to turn into a larger discussion on the career and of Michael Cimino and the aftermath of his 1980 film Heaven's Gate, what it meant for Hollywood, what it meant for him personally, and how we feel about it personally. So please welcome it to the podcast, Chris Esper. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by writer-director Chris Esper. He's a bit of a regular on the podcast now. We've discussed not only his work, but we've talked about Martin Scorsese, Andrei Tarkovsky, and Francois Truffaut. And today we're joining up to discuss one film in particular. It's a film that's pretty near and dear to Chris's heart, and it's one that I just watched for the first time in getting ready for this podcast. It's Michael Cimino's 1980 epic Heaven's Gate, which is infamous for a lot of reasons and has definitely a mixed reputation for a lot of reasons, some of which have nothing to do with the quality of the film itself. And I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion, and I definitely had some pretty strong feelings about the film myself. Chris, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Brian. It's always a pleasure to talk with you about films. No, this is great. I'm looking forward to this one.
Okay, so how did you first get in contact with watching Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate?
I got in touch with it kind of randomly, actually. I had heard about the film, the film's title in passing. Didn't know anything about it for years, and then I recall seeing a filmmaker's friend, a friend of mine who's a filmmaker. I saw his post on Facebook that said something along the lines of, "Oh, just watched a documentary about the making of Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate," and he was talking about how ego can ruin a studio, things like that. So I was curious, and I love that period of cinema, the 70s into the 80s, and so I found a documentary on YouTube. It's called Final Cut, I'm Making of Heaven's Gate, which is based on a book by Stephen Bach. And Stephen Bach was the head of United Artists at the time of the film's release and the making of the film. So I watched the documentary, and I was engrossed by it. I found it to be very fascinating, and quickly wanted to sort out the film itself after having seen the documentary, and found that, like yourself, I had very strong feelings about it. I was kind of mixed. I really liked it, particularly on a technical level. It's beautifully made movie. The cinematography, the actors are great, but I found the pacing to be very slow at times. But nonetheless, I like the movie. I still do. And I think it's a great flawed masterpiece. That's kind of how it's kind of my take on it. Mm-hmm. But I had since done more research about Michael Cimino, about his work, and to me, I mean, he's a filmmaker that I have since drawn inspiration from in different ways. I find it to be a very fascinating guy, a very fascinating character, and I find his films to be fascinating. All his films have sort of a central theme or look that when you look at them, you think that's a Michael Cimino film, mm-hmm. and it's undeniable. But so I still think he's a great artist, but I love the film for that reason, but also for the reason that it's a time capsule in that period of the transition from the 1970s to the 1980s in cinema, but ultimately in Hollywood, in the idea that the American auteur was going out and Heaven's Gate sort of just closed the door with its release. And the misconception seems to be that Heaven's Gate was the film that killed the system. It didn't necessarily kill the system. The system was already on its way out. The auteur, the idea of New Hollywood, the auteur, the American auteur, if you will, with the likes of George Lucas, Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, Peter Bogdanovich, etc. But Heaven's Gate, that moment in Hollywood is what just slammed the door shut. And so I find the film fascinating in that sense as well. So I think that's kind of how I came to like the film as much as I do.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that it is important to put that context in. I've been listening to the A's All Over podcast, and they long since discussed Heaven's Gate. And it's interesting and it is true that like Heaven's Gate very much slammed the door shut as far as studios giving directors unfettered final cut. I mean, we've already talked about Martin Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ on here. That's a movie that like he originally and it's for very different reasons, that he was originally going to set up and make in 1983, but then it took 5 more years after that, again for other reasons, not necessarily the death of the American auteur cinema, to get made. And so you have filmmakers like even somebody like Scorsese, who also, even though he had Raging Bull come out the same year as Heaven's Gate, he also struggled to make movies like King of Comedy and then After Hours.
Sure.
And it's one of those things where the blockbuster, by this point you have Jaws, you have Star Wars, you have Superman, you have the start of the rise of the blockbuster in movies, and studios' priorities got shifted from artistic expression to just how much money can we get, how much money can we make, and that's one of the things that's really fascinating about. So it's absolutely true that even though Heaven's Gate, it basically ruined a studio. I mean, United Artists, after the financial disaster of Heaven's Gate, never really got on its feet again as an independent studio. And that's a real shame. But the fact of the matter is, it's like, I think to a certain extent, Heaven's Gate is sort of the flashpoint of the death of the auteur theory in the auteur cinema in Hollywood. I mean, death is a bit of a strong word, because I mean you still have filmmakers with a very strong voice making movies at this point, but at the same time, just the idea of, oh, you're so and so, you get to do whatever you want. And,
right.
I mean, one of the things to remember about Cimino is that he was coming off of The Deer Hunter,
right,
when he made Heaven's Gate. So I mean, he'd just won 2 or 3 Oscars for that film, and so I mean, he basically could kind of do whatever he wanted, and so, it's fascinating to see that if somebody like him could go from his highest mark to arguably his lowest, even if quality-wise that it's not quite the low point for Cimino.
Right, exactly. And it's interesting that you mentioned that, because the thing that many who look back on his career, and also the folks at United Artists at the time of the making of Heaven's Gate, if you look back on his career prior to Heaven's Gate and prior to Deer Hunter, his background was in commercial directing. He was a commercial director, and he had done commercials for United Airlines and Pepsi, things like that. And actually, if you go on YouTube, you could find this commercial for United Airlines. It's like a bona fide Hollywood musical. It's beautiful, and it's just like you look at that and you can see why he became a filmmaker. And his background is in architecture and painting. That's what he studied in college. And so, so he was always about the visual and the extravagant, and nothing was easy with him, as someone said. But when it came to The Deer Hunter, even that film went a little over budget, a little over schedule, but there were legitimate reasons. For example, John Cazale was dying of bone cancer at the time, so there was that worry, and then there were plus shooting in. I don't know if they actually shot in Vietnam for the Vietnam scenes, but I know those scenes were incredibly difficult to shoot.
Yeah.
So that film did have a history as well, but it wasn't quite the same. And he argued with Universal Studios over the length of the film because ultimately The Deer Hunter is a 3-hour film, but the studio just wanted 2 hours. But in the end, he won the right to final cut, and so that warning alone didn't really go into United Artists' head. They just saw that he won an Academy Award, and they wanted to work with this guy.
Yeah.
And so they let him have complete creative control. And in that sense, they thought he was going to deliver a masterpiece. And so there is that sort of, misconception that I suppose that give the director the freedom and they'll deliver anything. But that's a cautionary tale. It ends up being in a lot of ways, and that's sort of why Hollywood is the way it is now. So there's a lot of events leading up to that, in that yes, he was an egomaniac, and yes, he did abuse his right to creative control. But on the other hand, I think the studio also put too much trust into him. So I think both parties are certainly at fault for what happened, because and many will jump on a bandwagon and say that he was nuts, and then the other bandwagon is that the studio should have reined him in or whatever. But it's like both parties were ultimately involved, so no one is really to blame. It's both parties,
Yeah. Now, when you eventually saw Heaven's Gate, have you seen multiple versions of it, or have you just seen? Because the only one I've seen is the 3.5-hour cut that Criterion released a few years ago.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the only one you've seen, or?
I've seen that one. I did see a while back on Hulu when they had other Criterion films. They had the 2.5-hour version of Heaven's Gate. Okay. That was ultimately released, I think, about 6 months after its initial premiere when it was recut.
Yeah.
I had attempted to watch it, but just the opening minutes were so disjointed. You could see where the cuts. So I ultimately didn't finish watching it because I felt that it just didn't do the film justice. Mm-hmm. There's also said to be a 5.5-hour version, which is what Cimino,
his original version that he released.
That was his original
studio. Yeah.
Yep, but the studio obviously said cut it down. So that version I don't believe was ever released. But if it's if it's out there somewhere, I'll absolutely watch it, of course. But the one I've seen is a 3.5-hour. Yeah,
and it's interesting because of the fact that it's like my feelings on the film, just my very base feelings on the film is that I think as far as the length goes, I think he's got a pretty good idea of how to get which scenes should go in and out, how to get from in and out of scene to scene. But at the same time, I think some of those scenes go on for punishingly long time.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, and I muse about this in my review, my written review, which will be on Sonic Cinema shortly, along with the release of this podcast, in that we can go ahead and start it with the graduation scene where Chris Christopherson and John Hurt's characters are graduating from
Harvard.
Harvard, and that's all really good. It has a really good flow from the very beginning shots of him racing to get to the graduation, and then John Hurt's character delivering this very this very pointed commentary to the commencement address that's just been given. And all of that is fantastic. All of that is really well done. It's really well paced, really well structured. And then Cimino has a celebration after it that just goes on and on and on. And it's like,
yes. Why
does this... I mean, okay, fine. Show a little bit of the celebration, but then get out of that scene.
That's right.
And it's like, that is kind of sort of... It sort of becomes the MO. That's sort of the way I felt every few scenes of Heaven's Gate, where it's like, okay, you've got a really good thing going here. Just get from the next scene to the next scene.
That's right.
The way he goes from scene to scene, it's obvious he knows the story he wants to tell. It's obvious he knows the story he wants to tell. He's like right there as far as how he wants to tell it, but he just kind of can't get out of his own way as far as getting out of some scenes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you about the graduation scene. I mean, I first saw that. I remember thinking, is this ever going to come back into the movie ultimately? And it sort of does thematically, but not really in an obvious way. So you kind of think, why is this scene even in here? That scene alone is, I think, the whole graduation scene, beginning to end, I think it's about at least 20, 25 minutes. That's a long scene.
It's pushing half an hour. It's pushing half an hour, and it's like, I mean, not even like Stanley Kubrick or somebody could get to make a scene. Could make a scene like that work for that long. Like, there's not really a filmmaker who could do that. I mean, the scene is beautiful. It's great. And later in the film, you could see where the themes of what's happening in the graduation sort of appears. They're talking about, they're talking about. I'm trying to remember the speech. I don't remember it too well, but I remember being about. There's like sort of themes of conformity in there, and also really just about being your own person. That's sort of how I remember it vaguely. I mean, that's a pretty good way of. Yeah, I mean that's kind of a good way of looking at. Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And so you can sort of see where that comes in, because obviously later in the film, Chris Christopherson's character, Jim Averill, he learns to fight for these people, and that theme of fighting for what you believe in, I suppose, sort of comes into play in the graduation speech. But I mean, unless you really look for it, it's there, because I remember first seeing the film. I remember thinking, why is this here? And then when I saw the film the second time, I listened closely to the graduation speech. I was like, oh, okay. Then it sort of connects. But I agree that the pacing of that alone, that could have been cut by at least a good 10 minutes or whatever. Yeah. But
Yeah, I mean, especially considering the fact that especially once you consider the fact that, like you said, I mean, it thematically speaking, that comes into play later, and one of the things that struck me, I mean, now that we're talking about a little bit more about the theme and the movie, it's like one of the things that really struck me is that Jim Averill is somebody who came from this Harvard education, basically like Harvard is sort of masters of the universe and stuff like that in terms of the elite, and the people that he ends up the people he's going to end up trying to protect and try to stand up with are people less fortunate than him in what they've been afforded in life. And one of the things that's really struck me is just, especially in one of the early scenes where the cattle barons in Wyoming are sort of laying out their plans for the settlements and the fact and trying to get rid of the immigrants and the criminals and stuff like that. It's something that really, when you think about some of the dialogue and discussion of immigration, of powerful people against quote unquote the others in society, it's like it's very modern. It really is a film that plays to modern ideas that we're arguing and debating now.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in that way, you can say that it's a timeless film because that issue never really goes away. It's been happening since the beginning, and it's still going on now. Even today, as a country in the United States, we're still dealing with that. I mean, especially I would say probably even more so now today than ever before.
Oh yeah, and I mean, considering the fact that it's an issue that's always been present in American society. It's an issue it's been present ever since the founding of America and the fight for America. It's always been that idea has always been, and that struggle has always been there. And so that is one of the things that I really loved about the movie and what really was taken by as far as the movie. And once you start to see that basically becomes the idea behind the movie, it's easier to, and it's one of those things where you can see where Cimino's building up. You can see the story that Cimino's building up. It's like once Jim arrives in Wyoming, basically those next few scenes are setting into focus what the ultimate story that Cimino's trying to impart.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And talking about this, something that just came into my head as well. One of the main characters in the film, Ella, that's played by Isabelle Huppert, she is a French woman that I guess she I don't know if she runs like the bordello that's in town.
Yeah.
And so it's like, so you think of it that way, you have someone that Jim Averill is obviously very close to, obviously very much in love with, and at the same time, she's a French woman, and the film doesn't, and the film acknowledges this for sure. Like it doesn't take that away. So I find that interesting as well that he's in love with someone who, in theory, is one of these immigrants that said that this county is trying to take out.
Yeah. At
the same time, as we saw in the graduation scene, his girlfriend is an attractive American blonde woman, and so there's a great contrast there that I don't know if that was intentional on Cimino's part. I don't think it was, because I know he fought hard for Isabelle Huppert when the studio said it doesn't make sense to have a French actress be the woman of a bordello in Wyoming in the 1940s, which that's very true. There was speculation that he was in a relationship with Isabelle Huppert, whatever the case might be. That somehow worked, I think, to the movie's advantage in its theme in some strange way, but intentional or otherwise.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like, and that that romance between Avril and Ella, the Isabelle Huppert character. It's like one of the things that I took note of was like it feels like those initial scenes between them are very are very stretched out, and feels like it's another one of those examples of Cimino sort of he can't let go of he's too fixated on just dotting the I's and crossing the T's when it's like, oh, I can't, he's like a writer who goes on and on and on, and this is kind of a weird comparison, but it's like it's a movie that I watched earlier this year and I absolutely love then, and it reminds me of Michael Douglas's writer in Wonder Boys, where it's like he's written this massive opus where it's like every little detail and stuff like that, but at a certain point he lost track of the story, and it's like he lost track of why those things were important to him, and so it's like he just can't get he needs to be able to just step back and realize, oh, I didn't need this. And the thing is,
exactly.
Like, those initial scenes aren't unnecessary. They're not completely unnecessary. And that's one of the things about the movie is that I feel like there aren't really too many scenes that are unnecessary in the movie, but the way Cimino cuts the scenes, it's like it feels like, oh well, really, we're still going on, and going on. It makes the scenes just not work in general.
I agree. Yeah. The movie a lot of times sort of meanders for at least a good hour. Like I think the plot of the film, where he's reading off the names on the death list from this county, that might come into play. I think around the 2-hour mark, maybe a little bit more than that. But it takes a while. It takes a while for the plot itself and the story to actually kick in. Everything prior to that is a lot of setup. I mean, my favorite scene in the film is the roller skating scene. I love that scene. Is it necessary though? No, it doesn't really doesn't add anything to the movie. But I love the scene. For some reason, I think it looks gorgeous, and it also captures the essence of that period, of that time, and also the essence of the people within the land, and how and it's interesting how the name of the rink is called Heaven's Gate, and obviously it's very intentional. If you're going to go deep about it, and this might be reading too deep into it, but I saw that as sort of like a paradise and or escape from the realities of what was going outside those four walls. And so I could see why that scene was in there if that was the intent of it, but I think it could have been cut down considerably. But I love that scene. I think it's great. But but it seems like that makes the movie meander before the point of it comes into play.
Oh yeah, I mean, and one of the thing, and as far as the roller skating scene in particular, I think it was in regards to that scene. It's like 3 extended scenes of like dancing and stuff like that. It feels excessive, and in the first, and having all 3 of those scenes in like the first 90 minutes of a 3.5-hour movie, it just doesn't work at all. And doesn't work at all. That individual scene is really good. Would I cut it in general? No, I wouldn't cut it completely. No. But at the same time, I also wouldn't necessarily, it's one of those things where it's like, you could probably get out of this scene a bit quicker.
Yes.
And I had forgotten there's so many fantastic people in this. John Hurt, Chris Christopherson, Jeff Bridges, and Christopher Walken, and Christopher Walken, Chris Christopherson, and Isabelle Huppert. form something of a love triangle. That starts to get going. Again, it's one of those things where it's like there's a lot, like you said, there's a lot of setup, but it takes a while for the story to really kick in. And that love triangle between Avril, Ella, and Champion, who's Christopher Walken's character, it's another example of that. And it's certainly not boring, and you certainly understand why it's in there because of the fact that, I mean, that's a very typical Hollywood film trope, the love triangle. Just another way of building tension and stuff like that. And especially given the fact that Avril and Champion, to a certain extent, are also on opposite sides of this.
Yep.
And so that's another way of building tension. For all of the time that Cimino spends on it, though, I'm not sure that it's completely, worth having in there. So,
I agree. Yeah.
But yeah, you mentioned Isabelle Huppert, and honestly, like, you can tell that this is very early in her career. You can tell, and she's grown into a wonderful actress. I don't know that Heaven's Gate is a good example of her as an actress. I think I think you can see how raw she is. I think you can see how she's not as experienced as the actors around her, and I think
I agree.
Shows.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that may have been her first motion picture.
Yeah.
With her speaking the English language. Before, I think she did only French films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that no doubt did not help. I mean,
no, not at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's to a certain extent, it's authentic for the type of character she's playing and the role, but at the same time, it also makes it hard to really accept her performance alongside of people like Christopherson and Christopher Walken, who are just absolutely just crushing it around her.
Yep. Absolutely.
So, yeah. And you talked about how beautiful the movie is, and it's like I watched on the I actually watched on the Stars app. They had the movie on the Stars app, so that's how I watched, and it was the Criterion cut. It made me wonder whether I'll be honest, is like I was not as impressed with the cinematography as I was expecting to be. And that really blows me away because of the fact that it's Vilmos Zsigmond, who's a brilliant cinematographer. And
yes, he was.
He's one of the great ones. But it's one of those things where it's like, there are some scenes in the movie that are absolutely beautiful, that are absolutely fantastic to watch, but at the same time, it's like there are other scenes where it's like, I mean, is it really that good looking of a movie? It's like, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of curious if it was exactly the same color grading and color scheme that's on the Criterion. It makes me want to check out the Criterion sometime to see how I feel about it. See how it looks in comparison.
I have the Criterion. It's the 4K restoration that Cimino himself actually supervised.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I actually saw. Let's see. I'm trying to remember where I first saw the film because it wasn't on Criterion when I first saw it. I first saw it. It may have been. I think it may have been on. It may have been on Hulu or it may have been on Amazon. Yeah. Oh yeah. It was on Amazon Prime. And I remember watching it on there. And the colors looked a little bit different. Like it had more of a dirty brown.
Yeah.
Whereas the Criterion, it had a lot of good saturation, very vibrant colors. Mm. Everything stood out more. So I have to wonder. Maybe it was a an original version from an original DVD or original VHS release, even for all we know. But I certainly saw a difference in the Criterion version. It looked very much a lot more cleaned up. The thing for me, though, that I've always noticed, and reviewers at the time at its release also pointed this out, was some of the dialogue being inaudible at times, which even in the Criterion version, I kind of agree. There is a sort of, there are times where you can't really understand the dialogue because there's so much detail in the sound mix with the noises, with the different Foley sounds, such as like trains and atmosphere and things like that.
Yeah.
That sometimes the dialogue is a little bit lost. I remember having to put the closed captioning on so I could hear what was going on, because there were some lines I missed. And I remember reading some reviews at the time of its release. I think from even like Vincent Canby and from Roger Ebert, and I think all of them said the same thing, that lines of dialogue were virtually inaudible at times. I was like, oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like, I know, I remember a few years ago, and this is kind of off topic, but it's the same kind of thing we're talking about from a technical standpoint. But it's like, I remember when Interstellar came out a few years ago, the Chris Nolan film, and the way that was mixed, and even Dunkirk is kind of the same way, where it's like you can't, the sound effects and the music supersede the dialogue, and it makes the dialogue very difficult to understand and very difficult to you sometimes lose the story and the characters to a certain extent when those cases. I don't remember if I noticed that too much with Heaven's Gate. I don't know if I got that, but it's one of those things where it's like you wonder. I appreciate, it's like I always appreciate filmmakers trying out different ways to tell stories from a technical standpoint. I mean, I'm very much a Christopher Nolan fan, and Interstellar is actually one of my favorite movies of his. And but it's one of those things where it's like at a certain point you kind of have to sort of accept that audiences need some they need as much. I feel like you can challenge them a bit when it comes to dialogue being audible and stuff like that, and emphasizing sound effects and music over dialogue. But at the same time, it's like you shouldn't really. There's only a certain point that I think that's really it gets to a point where it has a negative impact on the film if it
I agree.
Too far into that. So,
I agree. I think it certainly has to be a balance between what is artistic merit and then also what is ultimately acceptable, and also what the handle that you give to an audience. Because even with a film that is purely coming from artistic merit, there has to be a handle for an audience, be it in the sound mix or even in the themes of the film, what have you. This is something I was very conscious of. I mean, not to get off topic here, but this is something I was very conscious of when I was making Imposter, because it was a film that was very different in its approach and themes and all that, and I had to think about how would an audience grasp onto this without me being too artsy, and then also treading the line of being pretentious, and also at the same time treading the line of even being heavy-handed with the theme, because I wanted to be subtle about it, but at the same time, I also didn't want to spoon-feed the audience either. So it's like, well, how do you do that? And so I think that's a responsibility every filmmaker has, whatever film they make, but particularly with something even like Heaven's Gate, which is obviously very dialogue heavy, very theme driven, and also, it's often categorized as an art film, and it's easy to see why. So I think in that way, it is a responsibility of the filmmaker to have to sort of go onto that balance as to what is going to be understandable for the audience, and also at what point are they not compromising their artistic vision?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I do appreciate about Heaven's Gate and movies like it, even though I don't know that I would necessarily categorize the film as great. I think there are issues in the film that sort of take it out of that realm, but it's like it's impossible to dismiss it because of the fact that you can see the ambition behind it, because of the fact that you can see that there's a real voice there. I feel like there is a real voice there, and that you can see, and it feels very personal to me, though, this story.
Yeah,
like, I'm not completely clear all of his background. Maybe you can illuminate some of that for us. But it does feel like this is a very personal story to him.
Yeah, I would agree with that, certainly. If you look at all his films, there is that sort of all his films have a sense of Americana to it. Obviously, the Deer Hunter, very Americanic. But the other thing about his films too, they all have a certain theme of individualism, nonconformity, and also the idea of his films are also very operatic, and I mean that in the best of ways. In that they feel very epic, they feel very big, they have a large scope. Even if you look at his first film, his first feature as a director with Clint Eastwood and also Jeff Bridges, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. It's a caper comedy, but all the shots have a sense of scope. It's in the desert, much like Heaven's Gate. There's a lot of big sweeping shots, like in Deer Hunter. The films that came after Heaven's Gate, Year of the Dragon, the Sicilian especially. Those two in particular, they have a great sense of scope and scale, and so. I think it is personal for him in that sense. There is a sense of Americana to Heaven's Gate. There is a sense of individualism. And actually, one of the films that he wanted to do but never got to make was an adaptation of the book The Fountainhead, which also had a movie in the 1940s, 1949, I believe, with Was it Gary Cooper? Yeah, I think it was Gary Cooper.
So.
Yeah, and so he had written his own version of The Fountainhead, and if you know The Fountainhead, which I recently had a chance to, I'm actually in the middle of reading, it is very much a book about individualism, nonconformity. So you could certainly, and I think it's interesting in that you had a story with The Fountainhead about a guy who is an architect that wants to do his own ideas and is fighting for his own ideas, and ultimately it leads to this lead character sort of spinning on his own wheels, and then and it's coming back to bite him at the end. And I can't help but feel like that also happens to Cimino as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
In that he had grand ideas. He was perhaps ahead of his time, but at the same time, those ideas came back to bite him. And I can't help but feel like that's also his personal story. So I read that book, and I think people argue that The Fountainhead is about is sort of based on the life of the architect Frank Lloyd Wright. But I also think that in a way it's also about Cimino in that way. I think you read it and saw a lot of himself in there. And if you watch Heaven's Gate, you certainly see that as well. So it's very fascinating when you see the artist being reflected in their own work.
Yeah, and when you were talking about Cimino and some of the films they made, other films they made and stuff like that, I couldn't help but think of Sergio Leone and the way that he brought his particular sensibilities to American idioms, especially the Western. And and it's one of those things where it's like I still need to see Once Upon a Time in America. I still haven't seen that. I need to see it. But I mean, I've seen Once Upon a Time in the West. I've seen the Man with No Name trilogy. I love the Man with No Name trilogy. And it's one of those things where it's like you can tell that there's real insight and real vision, not only into he's got this big broad idea of America and this big broad idea of especially the American West and how America came to define itself especially in terms of Westerns. But at the same time, it's like you do have this very personal thing, and it's like I have no doubt that Cimino sees himself as Avril in this film. It's like it's obvious that there's a personal connection with Avril that he
absolutely
that he and that's why he wants to tell the story. And it's one of those things where it's like that's why ultimately it's hard not to, once you get going with Heaven's Gate, it's hard to stop watching.
Absolutely.
Even when scenes go on for what seems like an eternity, and even if there are some things that seem to go nowhere and then they all of a sudden come up later and talking about the American girlfriend that you see at the beginning in the celebration at the graduation, and then you don't really see her again in until the very end.
Till the very end, right?
It's one of those things where it's like you wonder, and that's one of those things. That was one of those weird things that scene at the end where it's like, well, I mean, you've seen what happened, sort of the ending of how Avril and Ella's relationship is doomed in that film and how it ends. But at the same time, it's like, what is... I can't help but think of, with that last scene, sort of like, what is Cimino trying to say in that? Does that mean that Avril sort of realized his place and sort of took his place as sort of like one of the elites, somebody who like I said, conforming to the elite idea of America and what he should have been doing, or is he trying to, and is he saying that's a good thing or not?
Right. Yeah. That for me, that last scene for me, as great as it was, I agree that it's not really clear what he's trying to say, and it makes the message of the film kind of muddled in that way. But nonetheless, there is sort of you do sort of get a sense that he's saying something, and you can look at it one of two ways, as you mentioned. Is Jim Averill conforming, or is he just simply or does he simply really believe that this is where he belonged the whole time?
Yeah.
And it's really that's kind of hard as you want to know, but at the same time, it also makes it also gives it a great opening to discussion, such as what we're doing right now, because we could talk about up and down all day, and I'm sure you watch the film again, you could come out of it with a different interpretation altogether.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of film in general, but particularly about that film is that you don't know what he's saying, but at the same time, it's interesting to debate what it is he's trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is, it's like, ultimately, I mean, there's a reason. Ultimately, you can tell that there's a reason that Criterion decided it needed to add this film into its collection.
Yeah.
And it's not, part of it is obviously the reputation it holds as far as what it represented financially speaking for everybody involved, for creative freedom for everybody involved, what happened to the studio, what happened to the film. It definitely has lessons to be learned from that. But at the same time, there is a real definitive artistic voice, I think, part of it, even if I'm not even sure, and it's one of those things where you wonder if, like we're saying, it's like we're not even sure whether Cimino necessarily knows what he's trying to say.
Right.
With that ending and what it means, and maybe that was his whole point of having the celebration at the end of the movie, as opposed to at the beginning of the movie, as opposed to just a quick cut of them celebrating and stuff like that, and then we're off to the story.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like you can tell that he's also somebody who did need to be reined into for a little bit. It's like who need a little bit more structure. I mean, you could say that, and we started off the year talking about Andrei Tarkovsky, and he's a good example of that, because it's like there are films where I adore all of his films. I can't live there. There are none of them that I can live without. But at the same time, it's like I can also acknowledge that there are some times where he's a bit too full of himself. I mean, especially in some of the lengthier scenes in The Sacrifice, especially when it comes to like nostalgia and those I don't know if I would necessarily include Stalker, but I mean Solaris. I feel like there are times where it's like he's somebody who I love when he is uncompromised, but at the same time, I also see why that was a problem for people, and I completely understand why Tarkovsky is not everybody's cup of tea. There's also I can also completely understand why Heaven's Gaze, why it wouldn't be somebody's cup of tea, but at the same time, I think part of the problem with Heaven's Gate is that so much of the discussion of it has landed on, well, is it Universal United Artists' fault that the film failed because they didn't give Cimino the freedom they should have to make the film, or was it Cimino's fault that the studio failed and all of this stuff? It's like this is sort of he said, she said part of the filmmaking process that is kind of frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. You make a good point about Tarkovsky. I would also add in there Kubrick as well, but particularly with films like Barry Lyndon or 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's not everyone's cup of tea. But I think the difference between Tarkovsky, Kubrick, and Heaven's Gate is that, in my mind, some may argue against this, but I feel like with Tarkovsky and with Kubrick, there is, at least in my opinion, there's no pretenses there. With their films, like you don't get a sense that they're reaching for something, but it's coming from a genuine place. Some may argue against that, and it's totally understandable to see why. With Heaven's Gate, while I don't think that there's a ton of pretense there, you could tell that there is, in a way. I mean, I've heard stories about Cimino shooting over 1 million feet of film on Heaven's Gate just so he can meet the quota in which Coppola shot Apocalypse Now. Because Apocalypse Now was another troubled production by United Artists, and he had millions of a couple $1 million over budget, strenuous amount of time. Obviously, a very troubled film. But Coppola had a good reason for making that film, and there were no pretenses behind that. There wasn't you watch that film. It's terrific, and it's a very admirable movie in a lot of ways. With Heaven's Gate, you can't really say the same thing. It's very hard to explain, but basically, I think it comes down to intent. Is to what was the intent of the filmmaker? Is there a genuine place from the heart of the filmmaker being seen here? And I think when you watch movies by Tarkovsky, Kubrick to a certain extent, and also from Coppola with Apocalypse Now, there is a genuine intent there to make something that is trying to say something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and you do bring up a good point about that, and it's like I think one of the things about, and it's like you kind of, I think one of the things that I certainly appreciate about Kubrick and Tarkovsky and Coppola to a certain extent, is the fact, or at least in that era of Coppola. I mean, you can certainly dispute later Coppola. As he had less and less freedom, and his vision for American zoetrope sort of went by the wayside. But the fact of the matter is, it's like I think one of the things about those filmmakers is that they were intent on presenting their vision regardless of whether you liked it or not. And it just so happened that for a lot of people, and for the people making the movies, although Tarkovsky's a different story because of the fact that he was making films at a time where the Russian government had more say over content than American studios have ever really tried to let the American government do, except for, especially after the Hays the Hays Code of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And after that, government interference in films and government dictating content in films. I mean, you could argue with military films that it's still very problematic as far as the relationship between government in terms of dictating the type of content of military films. But the fact of the matter is, it's like, but my ultimate point before I got off track there with Tarkovsky was that Kubrick and Tarkovsky, and Coppola, at least in that time, they made films that just happened to, they were clear about who they were. It's like, this is the type of filmmaker that I am. This is the type of film that I want to make. And it just so happened that people connected with that. And Cimino, I think, was still at that point, even after The Deer Hunter. You kind of feel like he was trying to get to that point himself, and he was not quite. He was sort of like early Kubrick, where it's like it took Kubrick a few films to get to the place where he did Lolita and Doctor Strangelove in 2001, Barry Lyndon, and all of that stuff, where he was the uncompromising, I know what I want to do filmmaker. And I feel like Cimino was still in that era.
Yeah. Well, there's that, and also the fact that Cimino at the time, Heaven's Gate was only his third film into his career.
Yeah.
So he was still, relatively young in his career, whereas Tarkovsky, Coppola, and Kubrick, by the time they became what they did ultimately become, that took them a long time to do so. Whereas I feel like Cimino, I hate to say it, but I think in a way, I think his own ego, especially wearing the Oscar, I think that got in his way.
Yeah.
Of being truly another Kubrick, because in a way he was at the time, because he was much like Kubrick, he was a proud perfectionist. Took multiple takes of scenes, was very detail oriented on things that most would dismiss. So you can't argue that he didn't have artistic vision. He most certainly did.
Yeah.
I think it was an issue of ego running rampant in this case. So I think had he done maybe 2 or 3 small pictures before doing something to the scale of Heaven's Gate, he could have very well have been someone in the same likes as the filmmakers that we've been discussing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I didn't even think about the fact that Deer Hunter was his third film, and yeah, he was still relatively young, and it's I think it is one of those cases where I think obviously his ego about what he wanted to do with Heaven's Gate and his perfectionism got in the way of that. But
Yes.
it's also interesting. It is also interesting to, again, it comes back to this context of when Heaven's Gate came out. And because the fact of the matter is, if Heaven's Gate had, you wonder whether Heaven's Gate, if it had come out like 6 years earlier, you wonder if maybe he would have been given another chance. I mean, I don't know if that necessarily would have been true, given the way he went over budget, and the considerable way he went over budget.
Sure.
But at the same time, you wonder if he had been like 5 years earlier, whether he would have been given another chance, or whether he would have just been a filmmaker that you just never really heard from again. And I mean, you know, he did make other films after Heaven's Gate. You already mentioned them, but you know, it is curious to think of whether because the fact of the matter is, the era he did make Heaven's Gate in was that whole idea of unfettered access to directors, except for you know, a few, kind of was going out the door. And so, you know, would he have got another chance? And again, it does. I think you do kind of have to look at the Oscars they made from the Deer Hunt he got from the Deer Hunter. If that's something that was kind of, because we see it now where it's like actors get Oscars young in their careers, or filmmakers get Oscars young, you know, early in their careers, and then they can't really. They're always striving for that other chance, or they just start to make progressively worse and worse decisions, or problematic decisions that sort of stunts their growth as an artist.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, that's sort of where Cimino's career serves as a cautionary tale of sorts, and also, much like his films, it's very operatic, his career, in that, you know, he had this very large trajectory to being great, to all of a sudden a very low trajectory of being a pariah. It's really, probably unlike any other filmmaker in the history of cinema, honestly.
Well, and it's weird because you know, a filmmaker that we haven't talked about, but who is kind of in the same vein, but also happened at the same time, was Terrence Malick, where it's like, he had Badlands, he had Days of Heaven, and then he vanished. He didn't do anything for 20 years. And
20 years,
that's another career that's just fascinating to consider. And now it was funny. It's like after The Thin Red Line, he did The New World, and then, you know, he gradually got into that type of career that most filmmakers do, where it's like, you know, I'll do a film every couple of years and stuff like that. But was that necessarily the best thing for him?
Right. Yeah. And go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Well, I was also going to bring up Orson Welles. You know, he's another filmmaker with a very, very strange trajectory, much like Cimino, and even Malick to a certain extent. You know, Welles came out the gate with Citizen Kane at the age of 24, 25 years old.
Yeah.
At a time when directors were not of that age, and had a quick trajectory of having made the greatest American film of all time. So people said for many years. That he had trouble getting other projects made, and, you know, the recent release of The Other Side of the Wind, there's a new renowned interest in his work as a director. You know, from the unreleased Othello, I can't remember if it was released. Othello. You know, that he tried doing Don Quixote, Touch of Evil. You know, so he did all these films, all of which had trouble being made simply because he couldn't get the money to make it, and he just became
Yeah.
a pariah of himself. And
Mhm.
so, you know, it's like, and it's one of those things where you praise a director to the skies, and then all of a sudden there's this complete downfall, and it's one of those things where you look at their careers and you think, okay, well, where does that come from? Does that come from ego? Does that come from overpraising? Does that come from lack of money? Does that come from of an audience or a community or critics wanting to see said artist fail in a way? Because that certainly does happen.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting when you study these careers and you think, what went wrong? You know.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Wells is definitely an interesting figure. I mean, it is important to put into the whole context of Wells' career that he might, with Citizen Kane, he ruffled some of the wrong feathers, you know, because it's a very thinly veiled shot at William Randolph Hearst. And needless to say, Hearst took his wrath out on Orson Welles after making that film, to where I do think a lot of it was, I think a lot of it was studios just being scared about giving Welles that type of creative freedom again. So I think that might have been part of it. And with, you know, Magnificent Ambersons and then each subsequent film, he would continue to make great films. That's the thing.
Yeah.
But like you said, it took longer and it was tougher and tougher for him to get those films made. And that's one of those things where watching a filmmaker like Wells, like Cimino, the way their careers follow, especially after early success, is fascinating. Now, Wells, I think he made the best of it as best he could.
Yes.
But I don't know if Cimino was really ever offered the same way, because so much of the independent, if the independent market had existed in the 80s the same way that it does now, or did even in the mid to late 90s, I think Cimino might have been able to rekindle his career to a certain extent. But because of the fact that the studios dominated everything in the 80s and the independent market wasn't quite what would be by even the end of the 80s, when you consider Steven Soderbergh starting off, it was tougher for a filmmaker like Cimino to get back on his feet.
Right, exactly, and well, like you said, I think had the availability of the independent market like today been available, he could have very well done so. I mean, Wells tried to do that because, I mean, Other Side of the Wind was done totally independently with with gear that his cinematographer Gary Graver had already owned and all of that. But that was difficult. I mean, that took Wells. I think Wells started working on that from 1970 until his death in 1985. It was an ongoing process. Whereas today, a film like that could be made in a considerable less amount of time. And I think had Cimino dived into that, he could have very well revamped his career in some way or another.
Yeah. And another thing that helped Wells along the way was the fact that his name, even if him as a filmmaker sort of had diminished respect, I don't know, to a certain extent, his name never really lost that respect to a certain amount. Because people still, they appreciated, especially once the French New Wave came in and they started reevaluating films like Citizen Kane and started saying, Citizen Kane's one of the great movies of all time, it's like
Sure.
he was going to, somebody was probably going to give him money along the way.
Absolutely.
And even if it's haltingly like for Others Have the Wind, which I still haven't seen and I need to see, even if it's something like his Don Quixote, which he never really finished, but if you've ever seen, it's a fascinating experiment to see what he was going to do with that.
Exactly.
The fact of the matter is, he was able to. He was always, Wells was somebody who, by virtue of his reputation as a giant, he was going to somebody was going to give him a chance, and it's like it's a shame that it is a shame that Cimino, after the Deer Hunter feels like a flash in the pan, because I mean his earlier successes, you can put those on with Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges were the stars of one of his films, so it's like, oh well, they were probably more part of the success of that than Cimino was, and so it's like it feels like he only had Cimino really only had 2 films that he's really known for.
Yeah.
And it's like one was, so it's easy for people to rationalize and say, oh, he was kind of a one-hit wonder that came really crashing down to earth with his next film.
Right, exactly. Well, it's you're right about Clint Eastwood and Jeff Bridges being attributed to the success of Thunderbolt to Lightfoot. It's because Eastwood had produced that film, you see, and so when at the time Cimino came out to Hollywood, he was a fresh face, of course. And, he co-wrote Style and Running, and then also Magnum Force for Eastwood. Based on that experience, Cimino had a script for Thunderbolt and Lightfoot and said to Eastwood, "I will sell the script as long as you let me direct it." And so Eastwood gave him that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the reasons why Cimino became a director, is because Clint Eastwood gave him that opportunity.
Yeah.
But the other thing to note as well, I mean, we mentioned Cimino's perfectionism and his obsessions with details and such. On Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, for what I understand, Eastwood as a director and as a producer doesn't like to do a lot of takes, maybe 3-4 takes or whatever.
Yeah.
And so he would constantly rein in Cimino on the set. And this is information I heard from the documentary. So, like, for example, if they had done so they did like 3-4 takes, and Cimino wanted to go for another take, Eastwood would be there saying, no, I think we got it. I think we can move on. And that's the way it went. But I think because he was being reined in, that's why that film got done as well as it did, and on time and on budget. Then when you get to films like The Deer Hunter at Heaven's Gate, where it was unbound creative freedom, then it's like, well, then you just let the line out of the gate,
Yeah. and it's like it would have been, I haven't seen, I'm fairly certain I've seen The Deer Hunter. I want to say I've seen The Deer Hunter. That would have been, that's like the only other one of his films that I would have seen, though. So it's like, I'm curious to see more of it. I'm curious to see his other films, see how I feel about him. And it's it's something that I definitely want to dig into as far as his film. So I will probably try to check out the final cut at some point, because I am curious about this film, and it's like I do kind of want to revisit Heaven's Gate at some point. I'm not sure when I'd necessarily be able to, because I mean it was hard enough to find one day where it's like I could do 3.5 hour movie.
Yeah, I know.
It's another thing to find that time again with all of the movies that come out and everything that I want to do otherwise, as far as other movies I want to discuss. But yeah, Heaven's Gate is one of those things that I think it's there's so many different angles to come through with it. I mean, even though, like I said, even though I do feel like just looking at the financial disaster and the aftermath of it, in terms of what it meant for United Artists, what it meant for sort of the creative freedom of the 70s, it's impossible, as we've shown, it's impossible, as we've talked about, it's impossible to not bring that perspective in there and to discuss the film on its own terms. The film on its own terms, though, is worth discussing. Because, I mean, there's a lot of things about it that are really, really good, that are really interesting, that are really beautiful, but there's also, it's so frustrating to watch for a lot of other reasons that, Cimino ultimately is, it's a great film, it's a great film sort of in the casing of a good film. It's a film that you can see a great film in there. It just doesn't. Cimino just can't really get out of his own way to let it be a great film.
Yeah, I agree, and that's sort of where the rest of his career took a turn. Because the rest of his career, while there are some good films, there is certainly a mixed bag. I mean, Year of the Dragon is very good. I think The Sicilian, it has its flaws, but it's a gorgeous looking movie. It's very good. And Scream Factory just released it last year on a Director's Cut Blu-ray. It's beautiful. And then he did the remake of Desperate Hours with Mickey Rourke, which for me was to me it's his weakest film. It didn't feel like a Cimino film. It was like it felt like a journeyman that was hired to make it. And there are certainly some signatures of him in there, but ultimately falls flat. And then his last film was The Sun Chaser with Woody Harrelson, and that one too. You could tell that it was a smaller budget and all of that, and so films like that, like all those films, they have some weaknesses to them. I have a feeling, I suspect maybe his confidence maybe his confidence sort of blew after the disaster at Heaven's Gate was.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine any filmmaker coming out of that unscathed, you know?
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, Heaven's Gate I think it's a film that I think film fans and film scholars are always going to look back on. And I mean, that's one of the things that, we talked about thematically, some of the things that I think make it timeless in terms of the way it deals with immigrants and the way it deals with power compared to, rich versus poor and all of that stuff. And there was one line in the movie that really resonated with me, that it's as true now as it was when the film was written. It's that I think it's Jeff Bridges and Chris Christopherson exchange, and it's getting dangerous to be poor in this country, and the response is it was always dangerous. And that's a very modern line. That's a very contemporary idea that is arguably more true now than it was then. I mean, it was getting true. And it's one of those things where it's like, if you've always been curious about Heaven's Gate, it's definitely worth your time to watch it.
Yeah.
And it's definitely worth your time to contemplate all of the things that we've talked about it, and to sort of just make up your own mind about it. It's like, it's a film. It feels like it's a big task of a movie to get through, and to a certain extent it is, from a storytelling standpoint, from an editing standpoint. But at the same time, it's something that's worth contemplating, and something that I can completely see filmmakers such as yourself being inspired by, to a certain extent. And just because of the fact that there's so much about it that I think is really good and is even great.
Yeah.
It just, there are other things about it that aren't as great. So,
yeah.
But I appreciate this discussion we've had tonight on the movie, and I hope that it does.
Likewise.
I hope it does inspire people to consider the film and to watch the film and to give us your thoughts on the film and see, and to open up a dialogue on the film, because it's a film that definitely is worth having a dialogue about. Whether
certainly.
you discuss it in terms of its place in film history, in terms of Cimino's career, in terms of the Western genre. I mean, just all sorts of things about it that are worth considering.
I agree. Absolutely.
Yeah. And Chris Esper, thank you very much for joining me tonight to discuss this.
Oh, thank you for having me, as always.
I'd like to thank Chris Esper for joining me tonight. It was really fun to discuss Heaven's Gate as well as a bunch of other topics with him with regards to cinema in the 70s, and just in general, the film and Michael Cimino's career. I'm definitely going to check out more of his work. And thank you very much for joining me at the podcast. Check us out at www.sonic-cinema.com as well as the YouTube Sonic Cinema podcast page. Check me out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema for more bonus content, including early access reviews and exclusive content about the book that I'm writing and hope to release soon, my own music, and more. So that's patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. For now, this is Brian Scuttle, and I've got a lot more really good stuff coming on the podcast in 2019. Including more discussions with Chris on individual films and a lot of filmmakers coming back and discussing films that mean a lot to them and films that have some interesting ideas for them. So thank you very much for joining me. This is Brian Scuttle. Have a good night.